The unions say it's unworkable. Is it?
Well, that all depends. Now, there will be a lot of people watching this morning who think, yep, I'm absolutely cheesed off with the rail strikes. We've had, really, since the start of June, the worst industrial action on the railways since the 1980s. And the idea is, and this was one of Liz Truss's promises, that if you stipulate a minimum level of service, whether that's one train in 5 or 2 trains in 5, then that is actually going to allow people to get to work, get to hospital appointments, get to see relatives, etc. And they say in Spain, in France, you already have similar legislation in transport. Let me tell you how that works. So air traffic controls in France happen generally every fortnight through the summer, and during those there will be a minimum level of service agreed. Well, when I say agreed, it imposed, and effectively the government says to the union, you've got to make sure you've got this many men and women in place, and the union effectively kind of grumbles and does that. Similarly, in Spain, when you've had strikes by cabin crew, they will sometimes be told, and I've been on a flight like this, you've got to fly, but that's all you do. You just look after the safety. You're not going to be selling tea and sandwiches and so on. So it sort of works, but the union response is so furious that they say effectively this is ripping up workers' rights to strike. That even the General Secretary of ASLEF, the Train Drivers Union, said, well, if you do that, you'll just find that you've got quite a lot of drivers phoning up sick. And it simply won't happen. So one of those things where I fear the effect could actually be, instead of solving the deepest rail dispute in 40 years, we're going to see actually the two sides further apart and even more action. And just to remind people, even though there's no Great Britain-wide strikes around at the moment, we have got a few cancellations tonight on East Midlands Railways because there's 2 days of strikes coming up there, then future strikes by train managers at Avanti West Coast, and a day's strike on the 29th of October in ScotRail. So a lot more coming up. And of course, the main rail unions say we're no closer a settlement. And so I fear there will be further disruption there too.
I mean, so the unions obviously aren't very happy, but this is good news, isn't it, for passengers to have a minimum service? Like you say, it does mean that you can get around, get your hospital appointments, get to see family. After a summer of strikes is what many people will be happy to hear.
Really good point, absolutely. But is it going to work? Now, during the strikes, even when we've had, so this is the first weekend actually with no strikes at all, but even last week when there was a national RMT strike, you still got about 1 train in 5 running, which is sort of what they're looking for.
Is that just people deciding not to strike of their own accord? It's
a combination of managers who are obviously able to work, but there aren't many of them. For instance, I got a train to Bristol driven by somebody who trains the train drivers. And people who don't belong to the union, or people, I guess, who there will be some who just think cost of living crisis, I cannot afford to lose a day's pay. So you can get a service running. And the thing is, if you say, right, we're going to run 40% of trains, who decides which ones those are, and who decides who's allowed to go on them? Because they're all going to fill up. Because we've got the policy here in the UK is if there's a space for you to stand up in a train, you can get on that train. So there's lots of problems associated with it. And as you were saying, it's not going to come until next year anyway, if it gets through a very divided Parliament. And it will be interesting to see how it does work and whether you can actually do this. We've seen really dramatic industrial relations legislation with unions having to give 2 weeks' notice of strikes, which has really transformed how things have been happening. So we shall see.